We've been doing this segment the last 2 weeks, so you can catch those on the Dexter Lake Facebook page if you didn't get a chance to see those. But I'm here tonight, and again, people will be getting this live. We had a little bit of technical difficulty getting started tonight. Our web or our internet system is down, but we are going to be getting people online. We're talking about marriage and quarantine. I think we were laughing how not to kill your spouse, but the reality is we're, 5 weeks into this at-home order, and the reality is we're doing a lot of adjusting. So tonight, I've got Dr. Rob Cook, and I've got Kelly and Vince Aldrich. They're here from Dexter Lake, and we're going to be having a conversation. But to start with, again, as people are getting on board, Vince and Kelly, why don't you just share for a moment a little bit about marriage and the ministry that you're part of here at Dexter Lake?
Go ahead.
A little bit about marriage. I am a widow. And Vince is divorced, so between the two of us, I think we have 42 years of marriage experience. We've been married almost 2 years, but that is a true God story of how God brought us together.
We don't have time for all that.
Yeah. So in all that, God really placed on our hearts to work with couples and building their relationship.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We love that you guys are here with us tonight. Rob, you've got some history in family and marriage. Again, you've introduced yourself a couple times, but for those who haven't met you, why don't you just share a little bit about your history and as a clinician, and your son, of course, is behind the camera, so you got some experience in family as well.
I do. My background is in marriage and family, and I have a master's in counseling psych and a doctorate in counseling, and Sandy, my wife, and I have been married now for 38 years.
Fantastic. All right. So how is it going? First of all, with quarantine, are you guys still civil with your spouses and you guys are surviving this?
Yeah.
We had 2 days that were rough so far, but they weren't even together, so I think we're doing okay. And they weren't horrible. So.
Okay.
I would concur with that. You know, we were best friends when we got married, and we're still best friends. So far, so good. It might change next week, but so far, so good.
Yeah, I was very thankful. Week 2, my wife turned to me like we were in our kitchen, and she just said out of the blue, "I'm glad that I like you." That's working for me too. Again, if you're joining us, if this is coming live on your news feed, this is our Mental Moment segment for this week. We've been doing this for the last 2 weeks. We're talking about marriage and quarantine tonight. This may go into 2 sessions, we'll see. We have some content to talk about here, but with Dr. Rob Cook and Vince and Kelly Aldrich, let's go ahead and get into this conversation. So we're now 4 or 5 weeks into this quarantine. Let's talk about how married couples are getting along. What are some of the things that you have noticed couples have been experiencing during this time? Have you heard anything? What are you suspecting people are going through?
Well, what we're seeing at the center is that any pre-existing condition, so to speak, for the nature of the relationship is now manifesting. Mm-hmm. So if the relationship was in trouble prior to COVID-19, this is not making that better. Okay. And so you'll see just that pre-existing condition is exacerbated or coming forward. The other feedback that we're getting about marriages is the complexity of trying to homeschool kids for parents who have never done that or have no experience with it, and then they're trying to work at home. And if they have young kids, those kids don't understand why mom or dad has to kind of isolate themselves in order to get their professional tasks done. And so we're getting feedback along those lines as well.
Yeah. Very good.
I actually had the thought, because originally I said, I really don't think we have anything to contribute to that, but I had the thought just a couple minutes prior to starting is, you know, if couples were healthy coming into this, they're probably doing all right. And if couples had problems, they're probably not. And that's a big part of our relationship or our ministry is to try and help people understand how to be healthy in their relationship, because storms and unexpected situations are going to arise, like we're in.
Yeah, how is it said? Ultimately, difficult times will reveal what was always there. Coming from a faith context, I really think it's a God thing. When difficulties come, when challenges come, it's really the benevolence of God that reveals what's there. Because God would want us to understand our vulnerability. And if we have the ability to see that, we have an opportunity to address it, right? Let's talk about communication. Obviously, one of the most important, most critical parts of relationship success. How has this shelter-in-place order affected couples in their ability to communicate?
I would make the same point. If they had strong communication patterns prior to this, they have robust communication patterns through this. Norman Wright once wrote that what blood is to the body, communication is to a marriage. And so if stress is putting pressure, even with strong communication patterns, the stress that we're experiencing with COVID-19 and all of the moving parts and the uncertainty will test the integrity of a couple's ability to communicate. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. When I think about, I've heard stories of families saying, we've had 42 meals together, they're obviously with kids, they're in the home, they're together. Many times couples are working both from the same place in the home, kids are running around. What's the most common difficulty in communication that we can imagine couples dealing with?
I think for us, what we have seen is a lot of people deal with emotions instead of facts. And something that we have strived for is let's put all the facts out on the table, because we know our feelings can lead us astray. So deal with the facts, and then once we've covered that, we seem to be able to move forward. So
There's another, to try and be very brief with this, another technique that we saw as a huge benefit, and people that we've shared this with have actually taken this diagram and put it on the refrigerator. So I'm going to be as quick as possible, but a lot of our Christian, most likely couples have heard of the love triangle, where you have God at the top point, and you have a husband and wife at the two lower points. And the concept, real quick, is to get, as I draw closer to God, I'm drawing closer to my spouse, because by default. But the concept that we twisted that into is there's two paths to God. And one is directly to God, but the other is to go through our spouse, because it's still a continuous path there. And in doing that, the trick of that is when I look at my spouse or communicate with my spouse, it's actually God living within that spouse. I should do it over here. It's God living within that spouse. So when I communicate with her, I'm actually communicating directly to God. I'm caring for God when I care for her. So in communicating, I look at this question kind of as the tone of communication. And are we being uplifting, or are we tearing down? Well, if I can keep in my mindset that I'm talking directly, and how I treat and speak with her is how I'm talking to God directly, it really puts me in check on my attitude in communication with her.
It seems like what you're referencing is respect. The greater, the higher the level of respect, the more cautious I'll be with how I communicate. Because sometimes when we're familiar with each other, we get lazy with our communication, and I'll say things that shouldn't be said or are poorly worded or what have you. But to your point, if you recognize the sanctity of that individual and Christ in them, that respect needs to be at high levels, especially during times of crisis.
Isn't it also true, and I'm asking in your clinical experiences, isn't it true that we tend to be more aggressive with the people that we trust the most? because there's no one in the world that I trust more than Kelly, and if I am going to be angry at something else, I can vent her because I know she's not gonna walk out. I know she's still gonna love me, and so I can vent to her, sometimes in an unhealthy way. Is that?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is safety and maturity. The greater the level of individual maturity, the more appropriate my communication will be. You're right, but when I feel like a person is safe, there's a margin of grace there. You know, I don't want to be careless with it for sure, but like Kelly would understand that you're not trying to intentionally hurt her, and that can make a difference.
I think with that, it's about creating that environment.
Yeah,
You know, we have to create that environment that we know it is safe.
yeah,
So creating that environment, knowing that I can tell Vince anything, knowing that he's not gonna come back on me.
yeah.
So it's creating that safety net of, you have to build that environment knowing I can fully trust you with what I'm gonna say, and vice versa.
I think in your earlier point about emotions, as emotion goes up, assessment goes down.
Right.
And so maturity would mandate that I am identifying and appropriately expressing emotions. And to your guys' point, that then creates a fertile soil for healthy communication.
Right. I do want to be clear though, what I was referring to is more of when it gets out of control.
Yeah,
And I lose my temper, maybe I stub my toe, but then I yell at her for not pushing the stool in. You know what I mean? And that's what I was referring to, and being cautious of that. But the word you used was respect.
yeah.
When I fully recognize the value that she is, and I respect my spouse, then I'll be slower to lash out.
So let me just add to this, because I'm sympathetic to people right now who are in a situation they've never been in before.
Yeah,
And they're experiencing emotions that are possibly brewing on the inside, and the difficulties are causing it to leak out. So Rob, speak to the issue of emotional intelligence, understanding what are emotions. Can we offer grace to myself, to people, in regard to experiencing emotion? And then what does it mean to regulate emotion as we go through this?
there's a lot there. With emotional intelligence, if we use Goldman's motto, he's got self-awareness, he's got self-management, he's got social awareness, and then relationship management. So again, connecting it to maturity. If a person is intentional about their level of maturity, one of the byproducts of that focus is going to be emotional regulation. The result of emotional regulation, to Kelly's point, is a safe environment. Or to Vince, they can look at it and have a margin, a fairly decent margin of grace, so that if he stubs his toe and does not handle it appropriately, it doesn't wash the whole communication and the relationship down the drain. So they have an adjustment. So when you're talking about emotional intelligence, it's usually some version of those four things. Emotional regulation makes the relationship safe. Now, there's a biological component to this. Our brains don't do well, or put it this way, our brains do well in short-term crisis. Our brains do not do well in long-term crisis where there isn't certainty or specificity. And so as this pandemic continues to evolve, what you'll see with couples is they're going to become more fearful about work, about kids, school, and that stress will keep building. And so again, if they have invested in the discipline of emotional regulation and maturity within the nature of the relationship, it won't always be pretty, but they will get through relatively unscathed. They'll have some scars, but it won't be irreversible, right? So I think, am I answering your question?
Yeah, I mean, if we did a little triage counseling here, right? Because people are watching, maybe they're grasping onto this, maybe they're connecting with their emotions, anger,
Yeah.
right? Nervousness, anxiety. not knowing what's going to happen and not knowing what to do with not knowing what's going to happen. What happens when people who are watching are relating to this idea of being dysregulated? Okay, is there grace for that? And then how do I triage that in these next 3 to 5 weeks when I don't have a counselor to go to or I don't have the right resources to go to?
Well, one of the things that I think is important is that we simplify all the stuff that we're trying to do. You can't simply do everything the same way as if the pandemic hasn't occurred. So to prioritize what is important and what isn't. In terms of emotional regulation, the most likely culprit that will do damage in a relationship is going to be anger.
Right.
And so for a person to identify what is causing the anger, anger is a secondary emotion. And so there's generally 4 feeders or tributaries of anger. It's control, fear, pain, and injustice. And in our context, we're vulnerable to all 4 of those. Mm-hmm. You know, people I love somehow got COVID-19, but they were exercising and eating right and doing all the right things, washing hands and disinfecting, and somehow they got it. That's an injustice. Or the fear and uncertainty of the future. That is going to drive anger. So if you're struggling with emotional regulation, it's important to try and identify what you're feeling. Then look at your perspective. Watch how you're interpreting things cognitively. This is the worst possible thing. Well, it's horrific, it's bad, but your context may not be as dire as somebody else's, right? So, and then reach out to friends or if family is safe for support. Those are some of the ideas I have.
Yeah, the one thing, I know when my mother was alive and she had a lot of health issues and sometimes she would get down and depressed about it, and she would say, I shouldn't be so bad, I shouldn't feel so bad because there's other people that have worse. So yes, what you just said is to gain reference, your situation may not be as bad as others, so don't let it panic you as much.
Right.
However, the truth is, it might be the worst thing they're dealing with. So it is real. It's
Right.
not trying to minimize it. We have to be real, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. What Vince is talking about is giving permission to feel bad for what's going on, and then to your point, allowing an accurate assessment. If I'm the one dealing with COVID-19, or I have a loved one on a ventilator, I don't know how to put a positive spin on that, right? You have to deal with that pain, and if it's an injustice, which can be real or perceived, the injustice of it, you have to deal with that. And in our culture, we don't like the negative or the hard emotions, yet they are provided by God to deal with a broken planet. That's a really good point.
I was going to say, though, we have to go through that pain to get to the other side. I learned that, in my husband's death, you can't escape around it. You have to go through it in order to get to the healing. So.
That's an excellent point. People in our culture, they try to bury pain or anesthetize it or sex it or drug it away, right? But healthy people go through it. And here's a point that we miss. For couples, we're talking about couples in quarantine, pain can facilitate intimacy. And we don't recognize that connection, that if there's maturity, which is the prerequisite for intimacy, then this pain can actually draw us closer as a couple, or if I can identify, and my story is similar to your story, there's a connection there. So yeah, that's a good point.
So we have a phrase that came to us, and I don't remember if it was when we were dating or when we were engaged, but it was certainly before we were married. And the phrase is forever changed. And see, she became a widow. She didn't see it coming. There were no warning signs. It was like that. I, through my ex's decision, I'm divorced. Through my ex's decision, and I had ways of processing through that. All right, it's time. You have to process through. So her world got flipped upside down, mine changed dramatically, but at some point we realized we are individually forever changed from who we were prior. So there's a lot of relationships that come out that say, over time, say, you're not the person I married. You're not who you used to be. Well, we never are. Each and every day we're a new creation. And so during this time of this quarantine, we're dealing with our spouses are not the same person that they were 6 weeks ago. We are a new person. And it doesn't matter, the example I always used prior was, it doesn't matter if it's a minor thing or a very large thing that forever changes. If there's a new restaurant, we've never been to it, as soon as we go, we're forever changed, because now we know exactly what the food's like, exactly what the atmosphere was before we didn't. If your spouse dies from a heart attack like that, well, that's obvious. Anyone can look at that and say, you're never going to be the same. So every morning when we wake up with our spouse in quarantine or in limitations or whatever each home life has changed, it's important to realize my spouse isn't even who she was yesterday. And so in the communication, in the conflicts, in the frustrations, in the emotions that come out of it, I think it's very helpful to recognize that see, we know we change, but we have a snapshot image. This was Kelly at this date that I remember. Well, you're not acting like that. Well, it's because she's not that person anymore.
I think what Vince is bringing up is really critical, because we have a tendency, even now with this quarantine, we want to go back to what was normal.
Right.
Yeah.
And to your point, that no longer exists.
Right.
And if we have the attitude that I'm going to go back and relive what was, I'm probably going to be very disappointed.
Right.
I have to embrace that this crisis is going to create change. And if it's in Christ, it's going to create change for good.
Well, and I think if we try to go back, then really we lose the growth that we're gaining out of it. So, and we grow in the process. And for me, like after losing my first husband, what I've gained out of loss is priceless. What you learn through that journey, and we can look at the same thing now with the whole quarantine, is what are we gaining out of it instead of what are we losing?
There's a Journey song, and I won't sing it. Normally I do if I talk about this. But the phrase is, I get the joy of rediscovering you. And during this process, each morning when we wake up and we get to look at our spouse and go, today I get to rediscover who you are today. Because you're not the same person that woke up next to me yesterday. So with that, it hopefully excites, and you're back to the dating. You're back to that initial excitement of, who is she? Why do you think like that now? Because you didn't. So I want to know why. So
Now, one thought is, you guys have testified that you've come through hardship to get to this attitude or this perspective. I'm mindful that there are many others who are on the other side of the wall, and they have yet to go through something that would really inform them in their marriage development. First for themselves as a person, which both of you did, and then to bring them together as a marriage. So I'm mindful of this continuum. That everybody is on somewhere on that continuum. Great target to hit. Don't lose the sight of this opportunity. So Rob, talk about this as a reality, but also as an opportunity.
For couples, the opportunity starts with the individual. So I, as a part of a couple, need to assess how I am responding to the crisis, whatever that may be, before I have to make decisions up front about responding to this in a healthy or a mature way. And then I can demonstrate that to my significant other spouse. Because I'm not responsible, I can't change them. So I have to take full responsibility for how I act, think, and feel, and respond appropriately. I can't farm that out. And if the two are kind of committed to that idea or that concept, they're already starting to walk towards a singular goal or vision, right? And so, and then I go back to something we talked about earlier. You can't tackle everything You can't tackle everything during a crisis. You have to simplify and identify what are those basic things I need to be doing to survive this crisis. And then, to your guys' point, there's a flexibility and acceptance of the other person's personality. Then you can start getting creative. If you're an introvert or an extrovert, you can then start to accommodate a little bit in your household. If the introvert needs some time alone, then help make that happen. If the extrovert needs some public attention, then throw them in front of a computer on Zoom or faculty or something like that. But for me, to focus on what I can control, which is me, and then to make the decision to respond accordingly and healthy. And if you don't know what that is, then there's resources out there that can help figure that out. But it starts
one day at a time, and give ourselves the permission that it's okay if I just do these 3 things today.
Agreed.
It's okay.
Well, what about, excuse me, what about taking that, we do have to focus on day to day because there are so many things out of our control right now. So we are in a bit of a survival mode in a relationship. What about the value of dreaming? We talk about that a lot, of keeping that hope out there, not trying to, in this, because it would only potentially lead to a lot of disappointment. Not saying, well, boy, if we're let loose on May 1st, or if we're let loose on May 15th, but I'm talking about plan a vacation for next year, even if you're not going to, even if you don't have the money. But dream, where would you go? If we had 2 weeks vacation, where would you go? Where would you want to go next week or next year?
Someplace hot now.
Someplace warm.
You know what I mean? To not focus on, man, I'm so tired of being cooped up.
Right.
Do you see value in that?
Yeah, I would say, again, perspective is everything. And again, I'm probably going to see people have all kinds of perspective. One of the things during this crisis is to shoot for that. You're talking about
what?
To shoot for the idea of asking those open-ended questions. The Gottmans, John and Julie Gottman, talk about love maps and the ability to ask good questions to discover your partner's world. Like, where would you want to go if you could go anywhere? It gets you thinking in terms of dreaming, like you said. And you're understanding more about your partner. On the other end of the continuum, there's going to be people who are going to be struggling just to survive the day. And I really like what Kelly said in regard to, let me just take today for what it is. Meet me where I'm at. If you're a spouse and you're stronger, like you were talking about earlier when we started, if I can work through my spouse and bear up their burdens and help them, if they can't do what maybe I'm doing, I can help them get to God a little bit easier. And they can do the same for me. Now, we've come to the end of our 30 minutes. We suspected we wouldn't have enough time to cover everything. So we'll be coming back next week and do part 2 of couples, right? We have passionate people who love this topic, and we want to continue speaking to this. We have special populations that we want to consider. There are people right now going through divorce. They're living in the same home together while their divorce is in suspension. There are difficulties that maybe you're going through. We want to keep that in mind. In fact, I would like to pray as we finish. I'm going to ask Kelly if you're okay, comfortable praying for our couples.
Sure, absolutely. Lord God, we just come to you tonight, and we just first and foremost say thank you. Thank you that we have you. Thank you that we can come to you. Thank you that you are our rock, our firm foundation. Lord, sometimes life just rattles us. It shakes us to our core. But I'm so thankful that we have an anchor to hold on to. Jesus, we just pray for all the couples that have tuned in tonight, Lord, that you would just speak to their heart. We thank you that we don't have to worry, and we don't have to take on the next day and the following days after that. You called us to take care of today.
Yes.
God, thank you that in you we have hope. In you we have faith. We do not have fear. God, thank you again that you have given us this time tonight, and thank you that you created marriage, and that you get to be a part of it. God, we are just in love with you, and just so thankful that we get to worship a mighty God. We get to celebrate Jesus Christ. Again, we honor you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week, and thanks for tuning in, and have a great evening.